Acknowledgement. Thank you. And welcome everyone to another OZeWAI Ask the Professional. Very excited for being on the panel for this one, which is a very interesting topic. We're doing a lot of work around accessibility maturity models, and we've got some amazing people here today. But I'm going to start with acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting today here in Canberra, and pay respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. And I extend the respect to all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. And please, if you'd like to put in the chat where you're paying your respects to today, your name and your role, we can go and we can start the discussion. Please also put any questions you have for the panelists in the chat, or at some stage at the end, we will put hands up. But we do have Rosie moderating those questions. Thank you, Rosie, as they come through the chat. And yeah, so I will do an intro in a moment, but first I'll hand it over to Greg, who is our moderator today.
Thanks, Bree. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And look, I'm like to also pay my respects. I'm coming to you from Wiradjuri country up here in central west New South Wales. So today we're going to be looking at what I'd have to say is one of my favourite piece of tools and frameworks of all time. Why? Because it's about shifting change. And that's the digital accessibility maturity model. And having a framework to can have that conversation is absolutely crucial. We are really, really lucky today because, we have one of the originators. Sheri is with us. We also have Julia and Bree both coming about how they're using it here in the organisation. But these three marvellous ladies have got an incredible wealth of experience and perspectives to share with us. Bree, I'll just pass it back to you for a second. Before we start, we've got a series of questions to ask them. I will ask at times, guys, if we're going along and I'll go, I don't have a digital bell, I'll interrupt and try and refocus some of us at times to keep us on time and also heading in that direction, because I know what some of our conversations can be like, and I'm one of the worst for doing it. So I admit that up front. Bree.
Thanks, Greg. And when you come back to you, maybe you just get an intro about your role as well, I guess, before you get started. But yeah, so Bree Norton, I'm the co-chair of OZeWAI. We used to be an annual conference, but now we are a professional organisation in Australia. We run these Ask the Professional events and network across Australia and states and support those networking events. We also have a consultant directory if you're looking for accessibility specialists in Australia. And we are growing, and it's getting very, very exciting to have so many members join, and so many members joining today too. So thank you. I'm also the accessibility specialist at an organisation today called, at the moment, been there nearly a year now, at AbilityWorks in Melbourne. It's an organisation that hire and employ people with lived experience of disability. And I'm part of a small team of the inclusive design area managed by my colleague, Natalie Collins, and a small team there. And we've recently done a piece of work for a large federal government department where we've used the digital accessibility model. And I'm here to share that experience today. Thank you.
Lovely. Julia, I'll get you to go next.
Yeah, hello. I'm Julia Hine. I'm here on Nipaluna, Hobart, on the land of the Muanina people, looking across the water at beautiful Kunungi, Mount Wellington. I am the Digital Accessibility and Inclusion Lead for Digital Experience Design Team in Australian Taxation Office. So that noise settle, yeah, and I've been working in government for 15 years, ACT government, Tasmanian government, now federal government, as all kinds of analyst and various roles with web administration, intranet specialists, and emergency comms specialist as well. But this is the first role I've had because it has been moved from a publishing role into a design role, which is specifically for accessibility. I've been in this role for about a year and a half now. and we're using the digital accessibility maturity model to shape what the role, the work stream, and the next steps forward are for the ATO.
Thanks, Julia. Sheri, do you want to share your bio with us and introduce
Sure.
yourself? That'd be wonderful.
So my name is Sheri Byrne-Haber. I am best known to the general public as the person who fixed accessibility for the kiosks and the drive-throughs at McDonald's. Macca's, I believe it's referred to in Australia. To accessibility nerds, the people who do the deep dives on accessibility, I'm probably best known for my work on the various different accessibility committees. So I'm on the W3C committee. I co-lead the maturity model group. I'm on the IAAP Global Leadership Council. Right now I am doing accessibility consulting mostly for cloud-based solutions. I've got this strange eclectic background. I started off with a degree in computer science, and then I went to law school thinking that, oh, yay, I was going to do intellectual property, which is like, you know, in Silicon Valley, one of the highest paying professions there is. And my last year of law school, we discovered that my daughter was going deaf. And so I did a hard right turn and ended up going into advocacy for the deaf and then digital accessibility from there. So, you know, I always say that people will do things for their kids that they won't necessarily do for themselves. I was born with spina bifida. I spent the first half of my life before the Americans with Disabilities Act, so got to do fun things like get excluded from field trips and had to be carried up by a football team captain to my to graduation because there was no ramp to the podium. And the maturity model came from what at the time, 4 years ago, was almost a throwaway question, which is the W3C has this amazing standard for getting something accessible. But getting something accessible isn't enough. Once you get it accessible, you have to keep it accessible. And so a small group of us started talking about, well, what is it that we can do to provide guidance for people who are implementing WCAG on how to do culture change to keep it accessible. And that's really where the maturity model came from. And like I said, we'll be coming up on our 4th anniversary in July. And our final, we've been in draft mode up until now. Our 1.0, you know, this is really ready to rock and roll. We've tested it a lot. You know, we've got a lot of feedback. People like it. That should be coming out hopefully before CSUN. So mid-March. If not before, then, you know, right after. Because as we were discussing before the recording started, W3C doesn't work particularly quickly because we're a consensus-driven organization. And sometimes it's hard to get people to agree on things, especially when it's a big group.
Thanks, Sheri. And folks, as your moderator, I'm Greg Alchin. I am the Principal Accessibility Specialist at Service New South Wales. Disability is a lived experience for me. My left eye is a plastic fantastic or a prosthesis. I'm legally blind in the right eye. And I have the pleasure and honour in this organisation of helping to build organisational culture and capacity and maturity on accessibility in everything we do. And Service New South Wales is the one-stop shop for our New South Wales customers, as we like to call them, not our citizens, but our customers, to access government services. So that's me, but I'd like to now get started more on the important questions here. I think we've heard from everybody about what their role is and about accessibility important. What I'd like to do is move more to how do you get started in using the maturity model? And look, Julia, sorry, Sheri, I'll start with you. Can you tell us more about the model and then how we get started, and then we'll hear from the others?
Sure. So there was somebody famous, spacing on his name, but he said you can't improve what you don't measure. And so the maturity model is all about taking something squishy which is accessibility, and disability inclusion, which is sometimes quite difficult to define, and turning it into something that can be A, objectively measured, and B, you can look at trends over time. So people will say, we're so bad, we don't even need to do, take a baseline because, we're not doing any of this. And the fact is that, baselines are useful information, if nothing else, because it forces you to figure out who the contact points are for all the things that need to be improved. So, for example, we have 7 dimensions in the W3C accessibility maturity model. So it's things like personnel and support and, IT, which then branches off into things like, QA versus development versus and internal software versus external software. So baselines are important. They should be done no matter how good or how bad you think your organization is. And then measuring them, usually I recommend every 6 months. Definitely no shorter than quarterly. Small organizations, if they're moving quickly, might want to do it a little bit faster. And then we have the spreadsheet, which is eventually going to turn into an HTML tool where people can answer and it will generate charts and do things like say, okay, you were 2.7.7 last time and you're 2.9 this time, so you've improved. But that's how you really get started. It's just a great big massive information gathering campaign.
And so just on this, all those different dimensions, they're kind of like all different cogs or gears within the engine that all play together to deliver that accessible experience. Would that be a simple analogy of it?
Absolutely. So people frequently think that accessibility is just about the product, but it's not about just the product. It's about the support and the documentation and the training and the conferences and the marketing websites and the social media. It's about the experience, which is much larger than the product. Well, then you start to look at, okay, what do I need to put in place to make sure that the experience is accessible? And the number one answer to that is you need people with lived experience who are comfortable bringing up these topics and suggesting improvements in the workplace. So I tell a story sometimes about, I'm a fairly early morning person. So I was usually, this is pre-pandemic, I was usually the first one in the office and I couldn't reach the coffee because they put it up on a shelf and I couldn't get to the coffee from my wheelchair. And so it's things as trivial as that then factor into, does the employee feel like they're included? Are they likely to stay there? Do they feel safe discussing their experience? And then from there, contributing to that big nebulous mass that makes your entire product experience inclusive.
That's great. Thank you for that. Julia, can you share with us how you've started to implement it there at ATO?
Yeah, so when I started the role was September 2023, and my director and I are looking at, what it should possibly be now and how we could involve it in the design team, embed it into our design practices, etc., for the web products for the ATO. That's my area's digital experience. So I just happened to be looking at things up, and very freshly minted copy of the presentation that Andrew Arch and Neil Jarvis gave at ID24, Inclusive Design 24 event, came up on YouTube about the maturity model. And I watched that and I was like, this is exactly what we need if we want to quantify what's the work stream, how far have we come. So the ATO has an incredibly high standard historically for accessibility in government. And that's been driven by a lot of people that came before me over the last 20 years. We've had embedded staff working in IT and in web authoring that have made extraordinary strides. But as Sheri said, it's all the other bits and pieces that aren't so obvious, like procurement and hiring and all these other things that you need to sort of tie the whole thing together in order to make it repeatable, sustainable processes that we can make business as usual, as opposed to, trying to reverse engineer things at the end of projects and stuff like that, which is often very expensive and doesn't work, and usually involves me having 2 days to do testing that should take 2 months, and all those kinds of things that happen when it's not factored in and planned at the beginning. So I took that model, pitched to my director. My director said, yes, let's pitch it to the her boss, the assistant commissioner. And I took that to him and I used elements of that presentation, and he stopped me after about 10 minutes and said, I'm sold. You don't need to tell me anything else, because it particularly appealed to that kind of front-end experienced web person. And when I said, just as Sheri said to start, that we can't measure it, we can't improve it. And he's a big data fan and would love to see something where we also can note how collaborative across. So the ATO has about 25,000 employees. It's a big place. There's a lot of people that are involved in aspects that affect web accessibility, particularly in HR areas and IT areas, and our area, and never the twain meet sort of thing. And there's legal and compliance, there's frontline comms, marketing and comms, all kinds of areas that don't belong organizationally together. So I'm using the model to actually track the stakeholders as well. So I did a scaled down version first, with it's just my team. I'm just completing that now. And then obviously within that, you're obviously still tracking things that are as high as whole of federal government policies. So then I'll just expand that up over the next 3 months. We'll do my branch using the model, and those results will then go back to the assistant commissioner and should have a lovely list of how wonderfully people have worked over the years, plus these are the gap analysis, and recommending that for a accessibility roadmap for next steps forward.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Julie. I really appreciate that. Bree, what about your experiences with the model?
Yeah, so interestingly, we've been called into at Ability Works, a small team. We've been working with a federal department who, unlike ATO, doesn't have a specific SME accessibility expertise in-house. So they reached out to us to help implement. They've got an inclusion strategy, this large government department, and the IT area, who has a responsibility for some of this inclusion strategy, weren't sure how they could go about implementing some of the strategy aspects. So we were engaged basically to assist them providing that specialist approach. And we suggested basically a combination of using the W3C maturity model, accessibility maturity model, as well as doing a quick check on, an update to how they can apply to the DTA's Digital Service Standard version 2, which also included basically an accessibility order on an external website, being able to reuse that for future projects. So it actually a little bit differently, even though it starts in the IT area, what they've done is we've provided them with the templates and the details and the check-ins and the expertise. But interestingly enough, the ICT area that engaged us are the ones that have made the connections across the department. And what they've found, which I really, really love, is that they're building on those relationships. They didn't know they existed before. They're finding out where that expertise is in the digital accessibility space, that they can maybe start champion networks, or maybe start, thinking about those connections for future mapping of the maturity model. Because at the moment, they actually in the very low, no launch or launch stages, because they don't have that expertise in-house. So one of the recommendations from that is that how can you build the expertise across those different dimensions? It's been very well received by the connections from the IT area that have reached out to the people area, the executive, the comms, specifically the website and intranet teams who are already doing a good job, as Julia mentioned as well. There's aspects there that are doing quite well, but they're not necessarily in the IT area. So it's been a great relationship building exercise, I think, for this team. And I think that in themselves is a great model. So we've got taken a little bit of a different approach, but I think the outcome initially, what we're learning will be similar to what Julia is. How do you actually find those right people that will take accountability and responsibility to enact that change that needs to happen for that area, because they've been involved, which is great.
That's great. And I think it is all those moving parts. But I think that for me, putting on multiple hats, because I sit on our disability employee resource group as well as my role in accessibility, it's how do I help use it to improve rates of disability employment within the organisation? And then it's also about how do I use the data from here to go, look, as we onboard new staff, if it's in design or our dev teams or whatever, what am I expecting of those staff from having a basic understanding of accessibility and building it into their job statements before they even arrive? And so how do we raise that capacity or expectation of their skill set before they come in, and then looking at what we provide? And I think that's the joy for me, the absolute joy of the maturity model is its application in multiple places. Yeah. Sheri, are you seeing that in all your experience where it's also being used in multiple places and for multiple purposes?
Definitely. So we built it to be as flexible as possible and not prescriptive. So actually you won't find a single mention of WCAG anywhere in the maturity model. You can adopt whatever standard you want. It's a measure of whether or not you're meeting that standard and whether you have the documentation and the processes to prove that you're meeting that standard. So the idea was that, a one-person consulting company could execute this within their scope, but, a multinational bank or a massive government organization could also implement it. And a lot of times what happens is things will happen as pilots. So somebody will say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm responsible for support, so I'm going to do the support dimension. And then when that gets reported out, people start asking questions about, well, what if we did this review for talent acquisition? What if we did this review for procurement? I'm one of the people that thinks that procurement is critical because you can't keep disabled employees or make them as productive as they can be unless you're procuring accessible products. And usually the procurement team has zero experience with accessibility. And so this helps them ask the right questions and be able to review the documentation that's provided by potential vendors to see which vendor is doing the best job at accessibility, if that's something that's important to you.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you've touched on one of my bones that I chew on, which is accessible procurement. I think it's one of our weak points. And I know, Bree, you could talk, both of us could talk ad infinitum on that one.
I assume you've seen Jeff Klein's book on accessible procurement and the PDAA. Okay, so he was actually involved with creating the procurement dimension for the accessibility maturity model. I literally talk to him every week.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and I think for us to, because in Australia, we adopted EN 301-549. We did the fancy thing, adding the letters AS for Australians in front of it. That there's not much difference between. And Canada's done the same, and that drives it for us too from a build and buy perspective. But then that fits into maturity model. Tell me, folks, in implementing the maturity model, I know you'll always get some people going, "Oh, I haven't got the evidence. Oh, this is what I'm going to do." And they go, no, don't tell me what you're going to do.
Show me what you did. It's a measurement. It's a measurement of current status. It is not a measurement of aspirations. And I'm just gonna point out something here. You said build and buy. I'm based in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is driven by open source. So we've actually taken it one step further, and we say buy, build, or use. Because as soon as you use something from the open source and have integrated it into your product, if it touches the UI and what you've brought in isn't accessible, you're hosed. It's not going to work.
Really great.
Open source, I think, is also super important to address, especially because open source a lot of times are people's PhD thesis and some project that they just had an idea and they sat down and did a quick and dirty hack. So open source by itself is almost never accessible. It's not until you get things like PayPal made, I don't know if you're familiar with PayPal or not. It's a banking. Yeah. Okay. So they wanted to use Bootstrap. This is about 10 years ago, but they wanted it to be accessible. So they actually made Bootstrap accessible and then contributed it back to the open source so that everybody who used Bootstrap going forward had the option to make their Bootstrap-based user interfaces accessible. So I think that's critical, as I'm constantly pushing companies not just to make their open source accessible, but to give it back. Don't be just open source takers, be open source givers to make it easier for others.
Yeah. That's great. And tell me, what have been the challenges, Julia? You've had a lot of good buy-in, but like anything, there would have been challenges in implementing maturity model. What have been the challenges that you've faced?
So just sort of a key one in the sort of instructions for how to use the maturity model, it says, take all of your products and list them all, and then compare them to, and there's your proof points. Well, this organization is just too big to ever stack every single thing up that's a comms product. That's so I've had to kind of, basically make it evidenced, but it's not exhaustive. So, on the other hand, were you to go and take the results of this and make it something where you wanted to audit your products, and it would give you excellent pointers on how, what, where, the contributing factors to making those products, So it's kind of the size of the place would be probably the biggest challenge. Another challenge for me is, so just, having been a business analyst in the past, like I can understand and use the template relatively easily and do the analysis, find the stakeholders, and so on. But it's very difficult in that size to keep everyone in mind and know I don't have blind spots. I'm not missing places where there are things that I can't know about. So I've got a colleague now and I working on drawing a digital accessibility ecosystem at the ATO, mapping it, as someone referred to before, because without that map, it's hard to sort of say whose roles, responsibilities, what areas, and make that something that's not just something I know is something, it's something we can refer to and use in future for business cases, for projects. Also forming a working group with those people is the next goal. And one of the outputs of that working group again would be toward the roadmap for digital accessibility. So yeah, it's kind of, although everything is there, it's quite a lot of legwork to find everyone. If I were in a smaller organization or a small department, I think it would be fairly obvious.
That's part of a larger issue of any large organization, isn't it? It's those silos and finding out who's who in the zoo and who's actually
and sometimes
doing
you're telling people news that they don't
Yeah.
particularly want to be handed hot potatoes or whatever as well, but haven't weighed in for a reason. And so so we're sort of undertaking some of that direct SME questioning in the near future, and try to actually get a group of people that can meet together, and then we left hand will know what the right hand is doing, kind of thing. Yeah, which I'm not used to because I'm from small government where I was a committee of one.
Yeah.
You held those really rich meetings with me, myself, and I. That's what
in depth, regularly. Yeah.
Bree, what about you? What have been some of the challenges that you've had?
So by doing it through us as a consultancy and a guidance through what is accessibility SMEs, is the challenges, I think, were more for our the people that we were engaged by in the ICT area to find those relationships. Who are the best people to fill it in. We actually used a lot of our collaboration approaches. It was a SharePoint Excel spreadsheet of the template that was shared. So once we found who the right people were, the contact said, "Can you just share the spreadsheet with this person?" And we put their section at the top so they can just put in their comments next to it. So some of that feedback I'd send back to Sheri to say, how can you gather information from other people into the template itself is probably some good feedback in future versions of it, because it was really useful. You could see where they had common answers to some of the responses from different areas. They went to security or the ICT or the web team, and all of them where the question said, do you have an ACR or a VPAT, or that kind of reference around procurement, the answer in this case was, what is this? So, which showed a level of, that they do not have that expertise in those areas to help assess what those things are. So, and then we provide recommendations afterwards. So unlike, so Julia's, probably doing this in-house and trying to track separately, we provided like overarching advice, some quick wins or some long-term goals of what they needed to do, especially around something what you're doing, Julia, which is a champions network. You're doing mapping the digital accessibility. We suggested something like what we had at New South Wales Government, Greg, which was an ambassadors, digital accessibility ambassadors, which was amazing to get people together like that who, you could all talk about what's happening in your area and how you could support each other. So you weren't duplicating training in one area. You could actually tap into what training's been done in the HR area and make sure that gets, pulled into the other dimensions. Those kinds of things we found out through an ambassadors network when I worked with Greg in New South Wales Government. So all those kinds of recommendations that came out of it are also the next steps of building their skills and knowledge around it as well. So I think the challenges are more for the organisation themselves to keep it going. But I think what I saw was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest from those areas when they were reached out to. And I think that's been a wonderful opportunity. It'll come with its own challenges when they see that we've made recommendations on who should be accountable, based on those people who put their responses in. So, it's, and I noticed that was a question that's come up, but the idea is that we've also made some recommendations as an external consultancy on which area should be accountable or responsible for those dimensions. So to give them a little bit more of an external, independent kind of approach to who should be responsible.
Yeah,
because currently they do have an accessibility, a disability champion. This person is is reactive, or actually wasn't even involved in the project. So one of the recommendations is to have those champions to be more proactive, engage and be accountable for some of the things that are happening through this maturity model approach.
That's great. Question for all of you here. There are all these dimensions within the maturity model, but if I'm trying to get executive buy-in across those dimensions, what's the overarching business requirement or performance statement that we're trying to achieve that will help drive all of those ones in? Like for us, we go, hey, all customers can easily and safely use our products and services regardless of their background and abilities. That's our performance statement. So we're going, so all these parts come in. Sheri, I'll start with you. How have you had those higher level conversations with the leaders about getting everybody to come along and play in the space to answer the questions?
So I take a three-pronged approach, depending on my audience. One is, it's a good idea, it's the right thing to do. And then usually followed by, here's the business case for it. If we make everything accessible to users through the UI, we think we can reduce our customer support costs 20%, for example, because you're not going to need to staff the phones because not as many people are going to be calling in for help. I'm based in the US. The third prong was usually it's the law, damn it. That may not be a prong I'm going to be able to get to use in the not too distant future. So being able to build a business case for it, on the one hand, yes, accessibility is a civil right. We should be doing it, and we shouldn't have to prove that it's going to save money. On the other side, if you can prove that it's going to save you money, it's hard for people to say no to it. So building business cases. There's this great study out of Norway. I can dig up the link later. That says for every $1 that you spend on inclusive design, you get $4 back. And that's one of the lower estimates I've seen, but it's also the most robust study I've seen. Also, there's this great study by, I think it was Accenture, about improved profits, increased ROI, improved sense of belonging, lower turnover. All of those things lead to more productivity and lower costs, specifically for organizations that were doing well at disability inclusion. And then, obviously accessibility is not 100% overlapping with that, but there's a fair amount of overlap between accessibility and disability inclusion. You certainly can't have disability inclusion without accessibility.
No, not at all. Thank you for that. Julia, what about you? Getting that buy-in. You touched on that earlier.
Yeah, no, it's just to add one to Sheri's list. There is the I think it's called the 1 in 10. So for every $1 you invest at the beginning of the design cycle, if you had to then do the same thing at the end of the design cycle, it costs 10 times as much. That's a good one for frightening people who do budgets and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of obvious evidence in the business case, but obviously I am a public servant, and a public servant lives by the policies, legislations and acts of Australian law. So at the moment, we've got the new digital experience policy suite that's been brought out by the Digital Transformation Agency. And under that, you've got the Digital Service Standard and the Digital Inclusion Standard. So they're the kind of things at the moment that they mainly are new and kind of unexplored, but that's a bit of leverage in the sense that I've been handling the comms about particularly the Digital Inclusion Standard, but all of it, because it adds to WCAG requirements, inclusion requirements that we haven't had in government before. And I think the other thing with getting traction is, so it's depressing, but a designer asked me the other week, so why haven't we ever been sued? And I said, well, I imagine people are having enough trouble navigating the NDIS that they don't have time to put together, or perhaps money to put together class actions and take on government departments who are doing their best efforts. The government departments have all these requirements. It means we are actioning, we are doing them. But that's the other reason why you've got the Human Rights Act, you've got the Anti-Discrimination Act. That also it makes it beyond just obvious that we just should. Do you know what I mean? It's the letter of the law as well, and it has to be followed. So, I think it's gone are the days when you can argue against doing this as a nice to have, or or arguing that you're not going to do it because it costs too much. I think those days are gone. I hope they are.
And look, I know, just flagging that there is some upcoming new advice coming from our Australian Human Rights Commission on digital accessibility and how it fits into the Disability Discrimination Act. So yeah, watch this space. I know it was supposed to have been out late last year, and we're all keen, but it's coming soon. Look, just coming back to this concept of how we're implementing it, Bree, how can OZeWAI best support accessibility specialists to understand the model and look at how they're going to implement it?
Yeah, I think, obviously running events like this where we actually find the people that are using it and putting it in place, and sharing what those challenges and opportunities are. We provide some, in our consultancy directory, options to reach out to SMEs to help with assistance in how you would do some accessibility maturity model assessment. One of the things we did for this federal government too is we brought in the inclusive research aspect as well, to that buy-in aspect. Obviously there was already an inclusion strategy that they had to try and work out how they were going to implement changes for that. So what we did is we ran some inclusive research workshops, as Julia knows. We've done a few of those as well. And we actually, we're able to do some, empathy mapping and understanding of what are the current barriers that people were, experiencing within this government department. So it's not like we just came in and said, oh, you need to change this. They heard it from their own staff. They heard it from, how someone is, if we interviewed someone, a couple of external people to look at the accessibility of one of their websites. On top of their normal accessibility audit. So with that feedback and a survey about what they understand about their inclusive strategy, all provided us with some really amazing quotes, experiences, stories that we could actually share back to support our recommendations. So, what are the barriers of people, to people to be hired within this organisation? We gathered answers for that, and some of them were not very positive, obviously, because their environment is not set up to be, accessible for people to hire or to be recruited, or once they are recruited, what kind of accommodations and support do they have? So we integrated those experiences and those stories from the organisation themselves to help with the recommendations that came with it. And I think that's where OZeWAI can help. We can help with finding the right people that can help with the assessment themselves, or maybe even facilitate the organisations to do the research for you, or to understand what those aspects of the dimensions are and how to implement them.
Yeah, that's great. Sheri, moving into that implementation phase, how can an organisation collaborate on the model internally, and use those results? So, yes, we've got the buy-in. Yes, we're going to implement this. Now, let's put the rubber on the road. How do we actually start to implement the use of the model?
So allies are pretty important. I posted in the chat, it's disappeared already, that accessibility needs to be viewed as everyone's job when it's at an organization that wants to not just say that they're disability inclusive, but actually be disability inclusive. So making sure that everybody at the organization knows what their role is and what their resources are, how to raise issues, providing multiple channels for education, office hours, lunch and learns, things like that, is how you get people on board or start their path to allyship. And then those are the people who are going to raise the issues when the accessibility team's not in the room. They're the ones who are going to be saying, sorry, the chat's threaded, and so I'm having I think it was Chantel who said people are leaving it to the end and treating it as a bug thing. Well, would you treat privacy as something you could leave to the end? Would you treat security as something you could leave to the end? Accessibility is the only form of regulatory compliance that the majority of people think that it's okay to leave to the end. And so being able to leverage privacy and security always come first. And they are your best friends. If you can get your company to shift from privacy and security to privacy, security, and accessibility, that's going to be a huge step towards getting more progress and getting people to work on it earlier. in an organization.
Yeah, and look, and I think that for me goes also back to when you're talking about, what gets measured gets done. What I know in service, what we've done is we've set accessibility as an essential business requirement, and that whole piece that everybody.
So in tech speak, we call that the definition of done.
Yeah.
Getting accessibility included into the definition of done is critical in tech companies.
Yeah, and if you've got that at the starting point, then you've got measurement from the start, don't you?
Yeah.
I just had that added to ours on our team, and it sort of expands across now into specs, trying to get a template for specs that go out for vendors, and make it clear what they need to adhere to, because there's always the answer is, oh, we thought if you gave us a draft or a CSS or something, it was already going to be compliant. We didn't have to do anything. And I was like, no, you need to do a lot, because that's what we're paying you for. So that needs to come into, I think, in the culture and providers in Australia. They need to have staff that are able to provide inclusive, accessible designs, as a default.
So you got to put it in the contracts, and then you have to have warranties and guarantees about, well, if a level A defect is reported, it's going to be fixed in, X amount of time. If a double A defect is reported, if, we get X number of defects in 30 days, you might be considered in breach of the contract because you're not your vendor's external quality assurance team. It's their job to be making sure it's accessible. We actually just had some litigation wrap up in the US. It took about 3 years, where the state of California ended up having to pay a $6 million settlement agreement because they contracted out a campground reservation system. The contract included, this has to be WCAG compliant. They did all the right things in the contract. The vendor sent back something that wasn't at all accessible. And the state says, you know what, that's okay. We just won't do it. We won't make you do it, even though it was in the contract. And so both the state and the vendor got sued. And they had to remediate it. They had to pay the plaintiff. There was substantial damages involved, not to mention legal fees that you have to pay when you get wrapped up on something like this. Inaccessible training materials, Megan, come up all the time. So the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation in the US, got sued because a blind business analyst wanted to apply for a transfer, and the products that he would have had to have used weren't accessible, and they wouldn't make an accommodation for that. So inaccessible products always put you at risk of litigation for unfair dismissal, or for I'm not sure what they call it in Australia, but biased, some sort of bias-based decision making.
And look, with the you've gone through this whole process. We've done the collected all the assessments. We've analysed the results. Now, how are we going to use the results? We've got the data. Now I want to turn it into information and action. So
every organization does it differently. The way I do it is fairly straightforward. You have to understand the first principle is the Zen of accessibility. If everything's top priority, nothing is top priority. You really have to stratify the list of things that have to get done. And so what I do is I have a matrix that I use to score, where it's based on the level of effort, the amount of the impact, and how many people are impacted. And so the maximum score you can have is 125. That means it's super easy, terrible impact, and lots of people are impacted. And then something that's cosmetic, that's hard to fix, that only impacts a very small number of people because it's buried in some sort of upgrade page that almost never gets access, that would be a 1. And everything else stratifies somewhere between 1 and 125. After that, it's just basic program management. You have so many hours, you have so much money, you have so much budget, you size each of these tickets, and then you draw the line where you run out of time or money. And the chunk that's above the line is what goes into your first sprint or release cycle or whatever you call it at your organization. And then new tickets will come in. They will need to have assessed and be weighed against the tickets that already exist. And then you go back and do the same thing again. In tech speak, we call it grooming the backlog. The backlog is all the open issues. Most people in Australia are probably familiar with Jira, and we can actually do things like provide Jira a number of hours and say, here, look at all the tickets that are tagged, with this particular tag. We have this amount of resources. Tell me which ones to fix. You can actually automate that. I've also built an AI-based learning LLM, large language model, that will look at a Jira set of open bugs and generate the basis for an ACR VPAT. It will identify all of the different EN 301549 criteria that are violated, and it will create a summary of the ticket for the remarks section. So there's a lot of things that you can do if you're really invested in this. Putting a little bit of thought and a little bit of effort into automating stuff that's going to have to be done repeatedly is going to have a significant payoff versus having somebody reviewing it every month manually.
Yeah. And look, just shifting gears out of the IT focus more to it's in people and culture and comms. How do we take those results and grow? Because in a lot of cases they won't be using Jira or using things like that. How do we help those areas implement the results?
So I can share a little bit from this government department, if you like. Yeah,
that'd be great.
So our recommendations, like I said, we supported it with experiences from their staff. So that in itself started to prioritize things. We used a tool called Easy Retro to prioritize some of the responses of what people thought were important. The other part of that is then what we did for quick wins and long-term goals. And we also, using the dimensions, what are the things that are impacting the others from not happening? So something like, that any new product that doesn't have accessibility in their procurement requirements is impacting everything across the board. It's impacting what they buy as an intranet. It's impacting what they buy as a HR tool or a training tool. So, some of those things impact those other dimensions. So they probably need to be, addressed sooner rather than later, or in conjunction with those other people accountable to say, how can we put this into our procurement policy? So we started to kind of identify what are things that could be done across the board, and suggested kind of a working group of managing those tasks that come out of the maturity model itself, and prioritizing them together. And that way they could then, because the different dimensions would go to those silos that are in a very large organization, very large government department, the idea is that that large working group would be able to task further down as in a racy type model of who will actually implement that. So it starts to become they would have to apply for that in their budget. They would have to, assign that work in their budget at that higher level as well. So that's the kind of approach that we recommended.
Yeah, that's great. Julie, what about you? How have you dealt with those non-IT areas in shifting the dial?
Yeah, well, we're very lucky at the ATO to have a rather extraordinary level of maturity, I'd have to say, in those areas. So we have a dedicated diversity and inclusion team, and they're in the people stream, and there are a lot of things that are very well developed and part of the furniture at the ATO, such as the internal diversity networks, one of which is the National Disability Network. I think it's well over 1,000 people,
Wow.
staff members. various executive champions for various parts of what needs to be acquitted there and in other diversity areas as well. Like I've never seen a culture like it. Myself being like 5 different kinds of diverse. I'm in quite a lot of clubs now. There's nothing, quite amazed in the workplace. I've nothing I can compare it to in my working life. So that means that you've got an established, I think there's, consultancy, advocacy, awareness, training, all kinds of stuff that I was able to mark very, very high when I rated that. And they were, even though I was doing an assessment on my sort of 15-member team, a lot of those things are out of our hands because they're agency policy. So I was actually marking against the very gold standard ATO. So even, there was almost perfect scores on a lot of that stuff, which, that just means that I actually have a very handy piece of culture, which is where everybody is aware pretty much that there's such a thing as digital accessibility and inclusion. And they're all aware, but as a standard piece of, this is a requirement. The gap that's left to fill for me is, yes, exactly what you say. What do we do now? So I think the biggest element of that where I have created a stream of work is what I call capability uplift. So I'm working with the learning and development area in people area, and we're pioneering a program with Bree's input as well there, some new ways of looking at how to fill those gaps across all general staff and role specific training areas, because we can't say people, you have a requirement to do this and not equip them with the skills to be able to quit on that requirement. And that is, with all the well-meaning people in the world that I have and the people who put in so much time and effort, as I say, over 20 years, have worked away, unless we can actually give people actionable things to do, like use accessibility checkers, here's the instructions, general staff, all the way to, here's social media accessibility, comms training, marketing and communication, those sorts of. So the inclusive user research workshop that we did with OZeWAI was fantastic. My team do elements of assessment of our digital products, and everybody got a lot out of that, super positive feedback. So just a suggestion when we say what could OZeWAI do to support this process, Bree, if you're interested, I'm always full of ideas for you. Unfortunately for Bree, I create work, Bree, I think.
That's
why we've got a community here, right? So it's going to benefit the whole community.
I'm giving back.
Lovely.
So I thought when I was doing this process, it's a very, like, understandably, it's still a draft. There's still things that are in flux. It's probably not the final product. So I'm not willing to cast any nasturtiums about that. But it is that if we had a dummy one that was filled in based on, real life experience, like Ability Works has, for instance, doing these things, and you could run a live walkthrough. Takes it out of the, like, I'm really bad at algebra, but I can do SharePoint. So do you know what I mean? But if I try to explain SharePoint to someone, it sounds like I'm trying to speak in algebra, even though it's quite a simple thing when you go and put your hand and kinetically do the process. And I think that would be the one thing, because I had to kind of build that for myself and walk myself through it.
Those scaffolds.
The instructions are there, but there are just the for dummies things that I didn't realize, like everything has to be assigned a value at every stage, or obviously the maths isn't going to work to produce the result at the bottom. And so if I were a person in a small organization just trying to do my best, say not for profit or something, not with a huge team of people like I've got to draw on all those assets and everything, and I wanted to just apply it, as a discrete sort of, here's a good way for us to think about what we might do better experience. Something like that, where we could just step by step walk through, engage, explain terminology, glossaries there, but just link people to where those instructions and everything and how they actually operate. It makes it a lot more approachable. I've been looking at it now for a year and a half, and it really just dropped for me in the last sort of 3 weeks, exactly how I was gonna. And once I'd done that, smash through things, but it took me all that time to get the institutional learning and knowledge and generate those contacts and everything anyway. But to actually just then go and apply that and put it down has just recently, light bulb sort of dropped in. So I think, anything we can do to make that more approachable is going to mean the adoption's going to be better. And that's kind of the comms polish that you might put on at the end of when the draft is launched or something, I assume, Sheri. I'm not speaking too far out of turn.
I was just going to say, just on that, and that's a great segue, Julia. Sheri, the question here, and I've got 2 more questions before I've got a list of questions from people in the chat here. How does an organisation provide feedback to the W3C? How do we close that loop back?
Yeah.
And how do we collaborate and work with you on that?
So anybody can become a W3C volunteer. Literally, you can do it in 3 minutes by signing up. So we have 3 levels. We have volunteers, which is anybody. We have invited experts, which are the people who are actually working on the documents. And then we have W3C employees, which there not a lot of them, but there's a few. We use GitHub. So if you go to that link that I gave you that takes you to the maturity model, there's actually a link that says how you ask a question or create an issue in GitHub. And we look at open GitHub issues literally every week. So it's not that you have to wait 6 months for a response. That's stuff when it's coming from actual users and not just theory. We tend to respond quite quickly. Up until the 1.0 publication of the maturity model, we were trying to put out updates every 3 months. That'll probably slow down a little bit because after 1.0 comes out, one of our focuses is going to be to get away from the spreadsheet and use a tool instead. Without going too much into the history, W3C actually had an enormous transformation in December of 2023. So that was literally only 15 months ago. And they went from being operated under a memorandum of understanding between 4 universities to its own standalone nonprofit. And so we couldn't get money to hire somebody to do that tool creation for us while that was all underway. And now that that's all resolved, our narrative is pretty much done. The next step will be to put resources into building a tool to support it.
That's brilliant. Really appreciate that. And talking of resources, ladies, how do people learn more about publicly available, accessible resources? Bri, I'll just start with you first off.
So we've started to, obviously put a lot on our OZeWAI website from what we learned through our Ask Professionals. And there's also an aspect there, Sheri, that I probably would like to reach out and see how OZeWAI can also collaborate on this with the maturity model and this tool itself. We've done something similar with our product accessibility list, where we are scoring products that have an ACR and providing a score for that. It's slowly growing. It's all volunteer, so please join OZeWAI and help volunteer your time to add to those or add your own products yourself. You can share that with us on the website. And look, I think there's an aspect to Greg of supporting the community where we can, and making sure that we all share together. I noticed someone put in there that they're doing a training chat space. If that's within government, then maybe it's going to be a bit harder to learn from those that are outside of government. OZeWAI can provide forums where it's actually across those things, and we're talking to some of the federal departments to see how OZeWAI can provide that community resource. So there's other options maybe where the space can be wider and you can learn from more organisations instead of within government itself, to see how they're actually implementing the maturity model. But we would love to be able to share feedback, Sheri, on how we've used it and the approach and the reporting. Julia, agree. There was another copy that I did find, and I don't have the link to it at the moment. I'll have to find it, of someone who had done a different type of assessment and shared it back. And that in itself, gave me some thinking about how I could approach it differently. So I think even just the scoring aspects itself, Sheri, there's some wonderful ways that you could reuse it in different ways to provide the feedback depending on what the organisation is looking for, rather than just one. I mean, the one that we've done for the federal department is it shows 0, but there's at least they can show that that they've got some percentages in some early parts. So you need to be able to share that aspect as well, and just show that it's a work in progress. As you said, Greg, it's a baseline, and a baseline is a good start, but you need to start tracking from something. If you don't have that tracking, you can't get going at all.
No, you got to get on the train. You can work your way up from third class to first class, but first get on the train. Sheri, apart from, of course, the wonderful resources that you've dropped into the chat there, and of course going to the maturity model, are there ones that you would also, other ones that you'd say, hey, these are my go-tos?
I'm not sure exactly what kind of tools you're necessarily referring to.
I think, well, we'll start around the maturity model, or things that, because it's got so many, as I said, all those dimensions, different things that can help feed in on that, or because there's enough out there about the WCAG itself.
Yeah. Let me think about that for a second. So as I mentioned, the maturity model is very flexible. So for example, if you're not doing any business in the EU because you're an Australian, organization that's strictly for Australian citizens, then you can trim out all of the stuff related to the EU from your scoring. So, kind of the short version is I made sure to fix all of the things that I didn't like about other people's work. I didn't like that you could put support in a VPAT in exchange for not applicable and make it look like you were doing better than you were really doing. Yeah. And so the maturity model doesn't let you do that. The maturity model does let you eliminate things and then base your score on the things that are applicable. Another thing that I saw in maturity models that I wasn't keen on was ones that were doing, you only have to do 3 out of 6 of these. Any 3 out of 6 will be fine. That will give you full credit in a particular dimension. I thought that was terrible because, it's like, okay, you're not doing 3 of them. Who are you leaving out? And how can you call yourself an accessible organization if you're leaving those things out? So, but those are kind of some holes that when we were originally doing our research were in other maturity models that we weren't quite as keen on. We did take what's called a capability maturity model approach to its creation, which is very technology oriented, but then we added some of the soft pieces like procurement and HR and communications and support on top of that. So it's a bit of a mix of the two. It's got the technology aspects to it, and it's got the non-technology aspects to it. But they're equally important. If you're missing one or you're missing the other, you're not going to be meeting your inclusion guidelines.
Yeah, that's very, very much true. And look, I think that's part of going, hey, the inside of my house is accessible. It's just that you can't get to the front door.
It's just that there's 3 steps to get in, right? You hear that about Airbnb all the freaking time, where people advertise a home as accessible, but there's a flight of stairs to get in. And it's like, oh my God, are you seriously kidding me? I forgot what I was going to say. It'll come back to me.
That's all right. I'm going to just shift to a couple of questions that have come up through the chat. First one, Julia. This is one direct from Megan from you. And look, I think she wants a play date. She's saying, I'd love to get you for the APS L&D, looks like community of practice, to talk about how you've implemented the maturity model. So no pressure, but if you can reach out to Morgan on that one, I'm not going to ask you for a yes in front or no in front of everybody, but Morgan wants to have a chat.
I can help to connect you there, Julia. So
Yeah.
and Megan.
Yeah, well, everyone knows I don't stop talking, so just stick a mic in.
Yeah, great.
It'll probably
That's what I'm
be.
after. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I would love to hear from the speakers. So at some point, if that's okay.
Thanks, Megan.
There
And
you
look,
go.
we've talked to Jessica from the digital profession as well. Maybe that's an
yep.
approach that we could do is actually do that step by
Yep.
step, you know, and putting the scores in and those kinds of things, Julia. We could do that together as an approach for the digital profession and show you how to use it.
Yes, and my second question there to Greg was that we are looking at maturing our business processes on how we maintain our learning product, and a lot of our legacy product is inaccessible. So as part of that maturity, we're looking at correcting those errors. So be very. I'm keen to sort of examine the maturity model from that perspective as well.
And look, Megan, just picking up on that, and I'm putting a line out there for everyone. If you come back to the Human Rights Commission, where a lot of us talk about WCAG AA, you'll notice for education and for emergency services and finances, it talks about AAA requirements.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I would just say that to the group. AAA has a place there. Thanks for those, Morgan. You've got here a question for the group. In my role, I find that people are very keen to make their IT products accessible, but are reluctant to put in the work to do all the stuff around it. For example, we have ongoing issues with accessibility not being included in procurement contracts. How can we encourage those external areas to be more engaged?
And that question brought back the thing that I thought and then forgot earlier, which is technology is easy, people are hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you need it's basic human nature that people do what they're rewarded to do. So if somebody's not going to get recognition for the work, if it's just more load on their plate, and they're not seeing what they're getting out of it, it's going to be very difficult to get buy-in. You need to figure out what motivates people to do accessibility, either through financial motivation in some cases or personal motivation in others. Somebody mentioned videos. I convinced McDonald's to make their Monopoly game accessible by showing a 20-second clip of a blind gentleman raving about how he hadn't been able to play Monopoly for more than 20 years and how much it meant to him that he could do it with a QR code and an iPhone, which he couldn't do before when it was just like the little stickers. I don't know if you have those in Australia or not, but just the ability to integrate at a game level with a brand is something that makes people happy. And getting those stories, not just sharing them like I'm sharing it with you right now, but embedding the video in the PowerPoint so that you can play it during the presentation, or the people have it if they're looking at the decks afterwards. It makes an absolute enormous difference.
Yeah, and look, I was going to say the other one that we've done is it's building the right dashboards too, so we can see and it's not only you've collected the data, it's the transparency of the data, and then how the data connects back into your KPIs.
And gamification. At a previous job, we had more than 100 products. So we had a dashboard that every executive had a bookmark for on their website, where they could see at any time how their product was doing with respect to accessibility as compared to another product in the same organization. People again, it's a motivating factor to, they might be willing to just put in that little bit of extra work if it bumps them up a place on the game board, because they're going to get executives seeing their name and seeing that they're doing well at something that the executives may care about.
Yeah. Fully agree.
Yes, it's a civil right, but you got to make them interested in it. And unless they're disabled themselves, especially younger people, who may not have much exposure to disability, you got to figure out how to make it interesting to them.
Yeah.
And this builds on to another question here from Chantel, and it says, my biggest barriers at present, everyone is happy and thinks it's important, but no one's taking accountability or actioning anything meaningful, and costing, given we require so much detail, which is difficult in a space that we will forever evolve and change. The mentality is just how to do it in BAU. But there is only one of me. Yep, I can relate to one being one. Do you have any advice on how best to approach this? I have suggested providing user stories and videos of the barriers faced within the department, digital products and services. I really need to ensure I turn buy into action and funding. So we have teams addressing the barriers. A big rich.
So another big myth of accessibility is we don't have any disabled customers. And I know everybody on this call knows that's a myth, but the problem is when you are so terrible that word has gotten around the disability community, don't bother, it's not worth it. People think that the lack of complaints means that they must be doing it well. And when the lack of complaints means they're doing it so poorly that nobody is bothering to complain. So user research, as you mentioned, is definitely key to floating some of those stories up. Doing surveys of the general, one of the things that we used to do was at the, you get this, if you opened a support ticket, you would get this automatic survey. How did we do? And it would ask you, there was just a yes/no question. Did a disability impact either the question that you were asking or the answer that you received? And, a shocking number of tickets that was involved. And so being able to provide those statistics definitely will motivate people. At least it'll motivate the leadership, and then the leadership has to motivate the teams who are doing the work.
Yeah, and look, I'm one of the things I'm proud of, just speaking about Service New South Wales. One, we have a digital accessibility customer council, so it has representatives from all the major disability peak bodies who meet with us on a quarterly to say, hey, what are we doing well? What aren't we doing well? What can we learn from other places? So I'm excited by what we do there, but it's those, as you say, it's those user stories. The other thing I would say, Chantel, look at your demographics of your customers. So like, for instance, here in New South Wales, I can go, hey, 25% of our adult customers are over 60. What do we know about the over 60s? And so it's how
or I'm always telling tech people, if you're in tech, 80% of your users are male. If you're not providing colorblind safe palettes, you're impacting 6.5% of your users. Guaranteed.
I think my mic is working. Hello. Difficulties with that in our department is we are the department that's named never ends. So it's Department of Infrastructure, Regional Development, Transport, Communications, and the Arts. And so the application of accessibility in every single area is slightly different. So we've got transport accessibility, art accessibility, general accessibility. I work in corporate, and we're just trying to get the basis of a foundation, because at the present we don't have anything. So our assistive tech doesn't work well. We're in the process of upgrading some systems, but it's our IT people seem to be relatively on board, and a lot of our HR folk, but they want the definite answer of how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, what do they need to do, when do they need to do it by, and they're all like, I give them the answers over and over again, and I've shown them firsthand how a screen reader couldn't use a onboarding form that we have, but it never seems to get any further than, oh, okay.
Yeah. I just want to share a moment. I work for the Department of Everything in Tasmania. It's the Department of Primary Parks, Water and the Environment, and they call us Department of Everything because we were earth, sea, sky, land, anything. A fire, it was us. A whale stranding, it was us. So I know how that is when you've got all these various stakeholders. Some are regulatory, some are, completely unrelated to other parts. That it doesn't help. Which is what I did, is to be the face of accessibility, be the champion, be the one putting the comms out. It doesn't help to overdo that and burn yourself out, because that is the danger. And on the other side of burning myself out from that, I've kind of now realized, oh, that's how come I'm now a specialist, is because I did everything I could. Sometimes I would definitely hit those walls, especially with, why does everything always seem to cost exactly $1 million? Why is it? That number just comes up over and over again, doesn't it? Anyway, so I think that what I did do positively in that is you can raise awareness, you can lift culture, you can be the person if somebody needs to ask somebody a question, and you can enable change. So what part of my PD is to be a cultural leader who is passionate about digital inclusion and accessibility. That in and of itself is a huge, that's why it's part of the model. That's a measurable in the model. Do you have a specialist? Do you have a champion? If you have to be all those things as one person, do as much as you can. And you personally have done enough because you've ticked a lot of boxes. But make sure people know you're doing that work. Because if they don't know you're doing that work, that's when you're going to burn out. But by the same token, they won't understand what the value is. If they see someone who is prepared to go above and beyond, they call it in the ATO, you're going above and beyond. So I always used to say, I would be bigger than the position I was in. And that's how I get promotions. I just do the things I need to do next. And that's going to happen for you. So don't worry, just keep going, but protect yourself from being
don't get burnt out.
That weight on your shoulders all the time.
I learned that the hard way in December. So we have pockets of greatness and support networks and executives. We've got those people that are in my corner. I started as an EA. I worked for the diversity, equity and inclusion team for a period of time before transitioning to focus on these issues because they kept coming up. So I started in IT, went to HR, went back to IT. So it's hard. Everybody knows what I do. I got good feedback when Intopia did our maturity assessment, but I was also identified as a key risk, so a single point of failure. I think people want to know how to do it, but we don't have any of the training or the resources to make the training, and so there's a couple of us that are taking most of the load, and we are both feeling the pain.
I see great things in your future. Because aren't we such a desirable category of employee at the moment? All of us.
We are. And also, can I just say that that's why OZeWAI changed our focus. We know that there are people going alone in a lot of these organizations. There's not everyone has teams of hundreds of people in their accessibility team. Even the ones we know of that we've organized panelists for Coucils and ANZ, there's a team of 2 or 3. That's why OZeWAI is here. We are here to be that network for you. We're to be that support. You guide us. Your membership guides us in what we deliver. I've put a link in the chat to the work we're doing in the FSO, because we know the education processes are not helping us in digital accessibility. Your feedback into the advocacy work that we do will help get you the kind of support that you need in those organizations when people do come to you and say, hey, I've heard that this is we need to bring a role in for an accessibility specialist. Actually, we need to build a team. How do we do that? Well, that's where OZeWAI can come in, because we've got those networks of how others have done it or they're starting to grow, and where you get that expertise and that training, that education. So that's one of the resources, I guess, Greg, that I should have shared earlier.
Yeah.
I told them they needed me. I didn't really give them a choice.
So one of the training resources that I always send people to, I dropped it in the chat. It's called teachaccess.org. If you're not familiar with it, it's got some great accessibility training in it, and it's free, which you can't really argue with. It's just at that point an investment in time rather than an investment in money. Another thing I would recommend is thinking about, how do I have a core set of accessibility requirements and then branch out into bits that are add-ons for your department of everything. So for example, you might have a special set of instructions for how to make museum exhibits accessible for your art people, that the people in other departments don't care about because they're not running museums. And then you could have PDF accessibility guidelines, for example, that apply perhaps to onboarding, because onboarding is death by 1,000 PDF files, that maybe the art people are less interested in. But trying to focus on the things that they really need to be interested in because of what they're specializing in and what they're delivering, and not making them learn everything that there is to know about accessibility, which, you know, as everybody on this call knows, it is hard and is not always the most useful approach. So yeah, that's just another thing that you can do to try to get people interested. But always look to see what's out there already. Don't recreate something until you've checked to see what's already available, because you'll be surprised that there's quite a bit of good, free, and low-cost materials available that you can just use or license.
And we actually we found that in the procurement process. I know Heron's on the call as well. There's a few of us that were involved in that. You know, understanding where accessibility fits into that procurement process in Australian organisations, mapping that out together and sharing, you know, what are the steps that we were doing. That was a really amazing shared resource that, you know, we've kind of summarised and put together as an article, and it probably needs a bit more work in our, you know, how we can actually put that roadmap out for people as an OZeWAI resource. So, you know, get involved and you will learn from a lot of others doing the same thing or something similar that you can incorporate quite quickly and not have to reinvent the wheel, as Sheri said. Thank you.
And there's another one I just dropped in there. So I was part of the ITIC. We did a series of trainings that we put on the ITIC YouTube channel to teach procurement people how to read VPATs. Okay, you should never have to write instructions for how to teach the people who were responsible for the VPAT template put together videos for procurement people on how to read them, and for QA people on how to write them. So always, you know, ask your favorite LLM or Google first, because there's a lot of stuff. You know, the US is very litigious, and a lot of this material resulted from litigation that's been going on for the last decade in the US.
Yeah, and look, folks, we're just coming up on time. I would like to say thank you to everybody for the wonderfully rich discussion and the great insights that we've got. I would like to just do a little share. You'll see in the chat there, I've put one of the resources from Senelec. It's the relates to the new Design for All standard. The Europeans have had it since 2019. Australia is about to adopt the Design for All standard. It's the precursor to 301, 549, and gets you to think about inclusive design and all the use cases. Sheri, it's brilliant. It would be lovely to see how we could bring part of that protocol document into the maturity model as part of that thinking. Is just something that occurred to me. Bree, I'll throw it back to you as our OZeWAI chair, one of our OZeWAI chairs, just to close off, but personally and professionally to say thank you to everybody. I really enjoyed this chat, as I always do with our great sessions. Bree.
Yeah, look, thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Sheri, Julia, always a pleasure. And Greg, always. It's just been so wonderful to get some of this expertise and really doing it quite early on, I think, for all of us. So we're not waiting until we're finished or we've kind of like got something that's mature or something like that. We're getting in and we're talking about it as we're learning, and wanting to share that back with W3C and with our colleagues and members on OZeWAI as well, so that everyone can learn together. So I really appreciate it, and that's what we're here for. So thank you again. Please join OZeWAI or share or subscribe for the newsletter. We're coming up to nearly 1,000 subscribers on our newsletter, our monthly newsletter, and be a part of the organisation that can give back to you with what you share with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Julia. And thank you, Sheri. Really appreciate you spending the time today.
Yeah, and definitely if you have any comments or questions while you're doing the trying to implement the maturity model, reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you find a bug, definitely file an issue ticket. I'll make sure that they get taken care of. We want people to adopt this. We're trying to make this easy, so we're always available to help.
Well done. Great work. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation. Bye.
You're very welcome, Sheri.
Take care, everyone.